This photograph shows Opatów from before the war. If you were coming in from Kielce, this is the view you would have been greeted with. There is the 13th century church, which stands out and still stands out very clearly. The houses are mainly made of wood, although there are some brick buildings as well. One of which is the mill. The mill is still there. It's been recently done up. In 2013, it was turned into a hotel and a restaurant. Another building of interest is a soap factory, which was owned by the Mandelbaum family. As far as I'm aware, they did not survive, but the owners of the mill did survive. They were sent to the Sandomierz ghetto, and from there they were able to escape. One thing that's particularly interesting is that it shows what the houses look like which were in the ghetto. This is not the ghetto itself, but the houses themselves were very similar. And you can imagine how difficult it must have been to have so many people living in houses of this type.
This gives a very similar view to the one in the photograph. Obviously there's more vegetation now. The former soap factory is gone, as are the ponds which were beside it. Nonetheless, the church and it appears some of the buildings are still there.
Here are two more photographs showing the area that was to become the ghetto in Opatów. Some of these buildings are still standing. For example, on the right hand side we can see the mikveh, the ritual baths, which you'll see later in the film. Other buildings were removed in more recent times, as late as the 1980s. People in those days would live around a well in a courtyard. So in this film here, for example, we can see where the well was. Now this well is no longer used, but it's still standing and it's a bit of an antique. Today, of course, people have plumbing at home.
This is Opatów. It's one of the oldest towns in Poland. It got its town rights in 1282, and there are many historic buildings here. Now where I'm standing, this is the main road, and I'm looking directly at the Warsaw Gate, which dates to 1520, and I believe there were 4 such gates, but this is the only one that's still standing. This is the main road. We're going to go from Warsaw to Rzeszów. You could probably go this way because it's the main road between Radom and Rzeszów. Now when a few years ago, I travelled down to Krosno, I went past this gate along this road. You may see the sign there to go up there to a monastery, monastery and church, which also dates from the middle of the 15th century, and it's on the site of something which was put up there in 1040. Now, what I'm going to do today, though, is I'm going to actually concentrate on the Second World War and what actually happened here. Opatów is known because Samuel Willenburg, who was the last survivor of Treblinka, he was taken from the Opatów ghetto to Treblinka and he escaped. Now he died in February 2016, only a few months ago, but this was largely a Jewish town, and we'll be looking more at that. But first, let's have a look at this church up here. This church dates to the 12th century. But the first thing I'll tell you about is the Second World War. When Opatów was captured by the Germans, the Wehrmacht, in the first days of the war, this area here was used as a temporary POW camp. I should say, maybe not camp's not the right word. The POWs were actually held here, I don't quite know how long that was for. You can see it's got a relatively high wall around it, and it was guarded. There were people who escaped from it, of course. So that gives you an idea of where prisoners were kept. This is the market square in Opatów. As you can see, it's a very large market square. It is one of the largest squares for a town of this size in Poland. And at the bottom, the other end, we can see the historic town hall. Despite its importance for the town, as we can see, there are places where buildings probably once stood. And what we've got in a couple of places is empty plots. In fact, there's 3 empty plots. Now, when the Germans arrived here, which I believe was Wednesday the 6th of September 1939, they deliberately burned several buildings here, which would have been shops at the time. I don't know if that was on the plots which are vacant now, but this was an act of vandalism which was to typify the rest of the occupation. Another thing which may have happened here, Samuel Willenburg writes that when the ghetto was liquidated, the occupants of the ghetto, some 7,000 people, were brought here, and then there was a selection, and the majority of them were directed to the trains which take them to Treblinka. Of course, they had to walk to the railway station, which would have taken them all day to get there. Another source says that when the ghetto was liquidated, then they went to a sports field, and as the ghetto was in the streets there, for example, here would be a logical place to collect people. So there's the ghetto there. What we've got here in front is a memorial to somebody who was executed here following the 1863 uprising. You have his name there. So Major Topor Żywiorski. So this monument was put up in 1924, and we've also got here a memorial to the people who died during the Polish Bolshevik War of 1920, and that's much newer. I presume that the names below and that are from the uprising of 1863, although I don't know. And another thing worth pointing out is that thing there, that red box with the words Swiss contribution written on it, and you see lots of things related to tourism in this area with the word Swiss contribution. This is the contribution Switzerland has to make for access to the European Union's free market. So for those who claim in the United Kingdom that it's they can have access for nothing, as you can see, it's not true. This building dates the 16th century. It's the town hall, and under the Russian occupation, this was used as a barracks. Outside today, some photographs of then and now, old photographs with new ones. And this part of the square, a whole square was used as a market, and as far as I can tell, this part above all, here where I am now, was particularly popular. The building which is directly in front of me was a prison located right next to the town hall and close to the ghetto. On the night of the 12th to 13th of March 1943, it was attacked by a local Home Army unit, and they managed to free 80 prisoners. Now what happened was that following Stalingrad, there was clearly a wave of hope everywhere, people becoming more interested in resisting the Germans, and they could see the point of resistance. So in an effort to try and control this, the Germans carried out raids in which a number of people were arrested. So they would take people out from this area and then to raid nearby villages, and prisoners were brought back here. Now to attack this was a pretty brave thing to do, really, because it may not look like much today, but just to take an example, on the other side of the square, somewhere around there was a SD office. Now there was 10 people who were stationed there, but further down there was the Polish police station. Another 10-12 people there. Now in total there were about 380 Germans or people working with the occupation authority in this area, including not only those but within the former area of the ghetto. There was a Luftwaffe detachment, and they had a light anti-aircraft gun. As it turned out, that anti-aircraft gun worked against them, because after the Home Army blew off the doors to the prison, which you can still see the doors today. I suspect they may be originally repaired, I don't know, just guessing. They got the prisoners out, and the anti-aircraft started firing. Other detachments which were in the neighbourhood included, there's a school here, and there was about 60 or so people from Schupo. There was a company which was working in the stadium, which had about 20 armed Germans and Treblinka men, and the rest include soldiers which were in this area. So there was a lot of activity. The raid was a success, and the prisoners were released. And I think it would make a jolly good film.
Co? Przedzwonię tego.
I don't know if prisons were actually kept here, and if they were, I presume it was all barred. Have a look at the other side of the prison, and whilst I'm here, I'll just point out that the gate to Sandomierz used to be down there, but it was taken away, as gates were taken away in many places at the beginning of the 19th century. We did the same in Newcastle, for example. Oh, now you can see the reverse. I don't quite know where the prisoners were held, but information about the prisoners, where they were kept, and also that the Germans were looking for new prisoners, was actually given by the warden of the prison, who was Polish, and he was handing information over to the Home Army. So that's how the Home Army knew when and how to attack this place. Let's continue further up into the ghetto. Returning to the question of the Russian army, roughly 9% of the entire Russian army before World War One came from lands that were Poland. So we had a situation whereby people were being conscripted, forced into the army for either 3 years if it was a artillery or infantry unit, or 4 years if it was for cavalry, although they probably didn't allow too many conscripts from Poland into cavalry. I don't know, I'm just guessing. But these were people who had rebelled several times. Now, bearing in mind that the majority of the population here was Jewish, and Jews had a particularly hard time in the Russian Empire with non-stop pogroms such as Kishinev, Odessa, but also pogroms happened within lands of which were Congress, Poland. And nearly always provoked, of course, by the Russian authorities. Now, within a short time of the occupation starting, the Jews were forced into the ghetto, which was 3 streets. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to show you these 3 streets, and this is the first one, Ulica Wąska. As you can see, there's quite a lot of land which was probably used once for houses but is not used for houses anymore. One thing that is shocking is that there were more than 7,000 people in here. So what happened was the outbreak of war, or outbreak of the occupation, let's say, there was roughly 5,200 Jews here, who were later joined by people above all from the area of Łódź and from larger towns, because they came to smaller places because they thought they'd get food easier, it'd be easier to hide, they'd have a better chance of survival. Historically, in the towns in wartime, there is starvation, whereas in the countryside, food can be obtained. So they came to places like this. Now, the Nazis forced people to live in this area. Another thing which happened very quickly was that people were forced to do slave labour. Initially, it would have been things like road building, which was nearby. Most of the roads around here were not tarmacked. They had no at all. It was just 2 tracks leading somewhere. Later on, people were kidnapped, sometimes pulled off the streets or whatever, or even the Judenrat said that they had to go because the Judenrat had to draw up the list of people. They went to the arms factories, which is the north of here, which were set up by the Poles, or Polish government, in the interwar period. So that was places like Skarżysko, Ostrowiec, and in the Świętokrzyski area in general. People, ironically, who were sent to Skarżysko had the best chance of survival, as it turned out, even though the conditions there were pretty terrible. Now, the exact size of the ghetto here I'm not too certain of, but I know from accounts that the street which is down the bottom here was used, because I found an account of somebody who was living in a street called Ulica Smetana. and he was living at Ulica Smetana 2. The family was given 2 rooms, which was, he said it was soaking wet inside. He'd lie down, go to sleep at night. In the morning it was like he'd just washed his hair, it was so wet. The floor was earthen. They brought a water barrel with them. Obviously must have been quite wealthy before, because they had a grain business, and they couldn't get the barrel inside, but they managed to leave the barrel outside. Now, the word cmentarz in Polish would be cemetery. It's the road that leads to the cemetery. It's the Catholic cemetery. Now, as far as I can tell, this cemetery was also used for shooting people, as was the Jewish cemetery. Normally, Nazis took Jews to the Jewish cemetery, and Catholics the Catholic cemetery, but not always. So this part, these houses here, as far as I can tell, were part of the ghetto, which makes this, because that means that this road here was dissected. I suspect that when they came to closing it off, that this bit was not included. The person who gave this testimony was taken to one of the weapons plants before the ghetto was closed off in May of 1942. Now, up there, where it says Kruvka today, that was the Jewish ritual baths at the mikveh. But come to that a bit later. Now, whereas not many houses from the Second World War have survived, there are some. And this will give you an idea of what it must have been like to live here. Because at a time when there was more than 7,000 people were forced to live in these 3 streets, which didn't have these buildings as tall as we have today, but were buildings that looked like that. And so you could have a situation, I saw one account saying 5 families in one room in certain places. Now, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, his entire family was put into 2 rooms, so well, maybe it was really tiny rooms, I'm unable to say. He also mentioned that his father managed to buy a stove from somewhere. Of course, the Jews were made up of small businesses, the blacksmiths, the tailors, the shoemakers and all the rest of it. There would have been people there who knew how to make a stove. Now, the brick building, which is coming to the right, with the sort of plastic-like facade at the bottom, that was apparently a prayer house at one time. Now, the synagogue, one of them, was also in this street. I'm not terribly certain where it was, because I've seen drawings of it, and it's clearly on a slope. Now, this tree here, on this plot of land where once would have been buildings, the tree's probably 35 years old, something like that, date to about 1980, because they grow quite quickly. You see these empty plots where there were once houses. The population was, because the Jews were gone, so that's 61% of the population were gone, and many of the locals went as well. So you've got a population which was declining. The locals went after the war, I should say. Although, as you can see, there's plenty of socialist era architecture. This street is Szeroka. The names were changed in 1948. Previously it was known as Yoselowicza or Żydowska, ulica Żydowska, the Jews street. That street held the Judenrat building, which existed during the war, as well as the Jewish community centre before. One of the problems that existed here was disease such as typhus and starvation. Diseases which were caused by the massive overcrowding in, as you can see, in houses such as this one, with so many people living inside, the lack of sanitary facilities and the difficulty in obtaining water. And without a doubt hundreds of people did die of these diseases. Now, it was possible to leave the ghetto, of course, on pain of death, because it wasn't closed. In May 1942, the ghetto was closed. I presume that this was done by the use of barbed wire and maybe a wooden fence. Can't find evidence of exactly how it was done, but it wouldn't have been done something like in Warsaw with a brick wall or something. Just as far as the Nazis were concerned, for 7,000 people it wasn't worth the bother. One thing does come out at the beginning of the time of the ghetto was there seems to have been relatively I won't say good relations, but better relations than existed with the occupying authorities in other places. For example, there is schooling was allowed. The Judenrat asked for permission to continue schools, and that was allowed, which is quite unusual. As far as the liquidation of the ghetto is concerned, what we know from, for example, Samuel Willenburg, who wrote his book Revolt in Treblinka, and he stated, he arrived here from Częstochowa, so I suspect he may have spent a couple of months here. There was things he didn't write about. For example, in January of 1942, people came here from Silesia, young people who managed to get weapons somehow, and those people were betrayed, probably by informers. There were informers in all the ghettos, and then you've got the names of some of the people here. One of the names was something like Mandelbaum, but undoubtedly there were others. So the Germans found the weapons, and the weapons were confiscated, and the people who brought them were killed. Now, Willenburg, who was engaged in the Home Army, he does not mention that. So that's, and I know he was in Częstochowa beforehand, because he mentions the way when his sisters were arrested. He stated that on the day of the liquidation, a drummer was sent through the ghetto streets, these ones I just walked through now, telling people to get up 4 in the morning. Another account gives it as 5 in the morning, and also mentions sirens going off. Now, the people were then collected either in the main square, which you just saw to my right, or in another place. Some people were selected to stay behind and dismantle the ghetto, or also accounts on some of them, because we know that 4 people actually made it back from Treblinka. 2 of them were executed murdered, I should say, in Skarżysko Kamienne. They made it back, some of them ended up in the work camp there. They tried to escape again and they were hanged. The other two, I've no idea what happened to them, but these are based on witness accounts, so they were able to say what happened at Treblinka. It wasn't just a case they had been in the camp. I'm unable to give any details of how they managed to escape or managed to make it back here, a distance of a couple of 100 kilometers. So this is the mikveh. We now make the kruvka, which is a type of toffee. I think even got this up in English. You know, 19th century baths used for ritual immersion to the Jewish community in Opatów. You know, it's the regional dairy cooperative. It's like a toffee, a kruvka. It's like softer though than we Anglo-Saxons have as our toffees. Can't make me also do a tour around the toffee plant. Should be so interesting. This is the former Jewish cemetery in Opatów. The Nazis first destroyed it, then in 1956 the communist authorities made a park out of it with children's school. Recently the school playground left the area of the former cemetery, and this gate was put up. What is left of the Jewish cemetery today, a place where thousands of Jews lived 75 years ago. These 8 stones, or remnants of 8 stones, because they were smashed up and had to be set in concrete. This one is from 1989 to recall the Jews who lived in Opatów. This is the former Jewish cemetery. So the second Jewish cemetery, there was another one which was closed. See how big it is. After the war, there were people who survived, but they didn't come back. You know. So you can see now this very typically Jewish ghetto, how it was wiped out by the Nazis. And now, 75 years later almost, how it still has not recovered. What the Nazis did by removing the intelligentsia, both Catholic or Jewish and other religions, they killed off the Jews and made most of the small businesses, who were then farmers, were unable to get their ploughs fixed and all the rest of it, the horses shoed. These are the effects which I think are often forgotten about. So, and after the Second World War, this was occupied by the Soviet Union with their own form of economic mismanagement, the forms of oppression to liquidate those who had taken part in the struggle against the Nazis in the Home Army and others. And it's only since 89 that we've had a free economy and a free country, but 26 years, or 27 now, have really, okay, I'm sure it looks much nicer than it did before and there's more hope than there was before, but you can tell how much it is still suffering from what the Nazis, alongside their communist allies, did.